Hi, everybody. It's a great honor to be here and to be included in such a distinguished lineup of speakers. And I'm grateful to be included and grateful, too, to the great people backstage who worked so hard to make this happen. Where to begin? When I was a boy, before I learned how to read and write, I would tiptoe sometimes into my father's office, and I would secretly roll a piece of paper into his typewriter. And I would, like Bugs Bunny when he sat down at the piano, I would poise my fingers above the keys, and then I would go ba 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 ba, and I would n n n n n n and asterisk asterisk and 7777 MMM space LL QQQ and fill the whole page. And then I would bring the paper down to my father, and I would say, "What does it say?" And he would take it, and he'd look at it, and he'd stern look on his face, and he'd look up at me and back at the paper and up at me again. And pretty soon, a smile would emerge, and his eyes would widen. He said, "Did you write this?" I said, "Yes, I did." I said, "What does it say?" He says, "Well, I can't believe this. 7 years ago." That meant the world to me then. It's 50 years later. In a few weeks, I have a book coming out. He hasn't read it, hasn't seen it. I'm very eager for him to tell me what it says. On June 1st, 2012, so 22 months ago or so, I stood before a group of high school kids whom I knew pretty well and liked very much, and gave a commencement speech. When I came down off the stage, my life suddenly changed very much, and a mild-mannered, quiet English teacher, probably would have been played by somebody like Jimmy Stewart in the movie maybe, had an opportunity to write a book. And I didn't know if I could write a book, but it just seemed too exciting a chance, possibility, opportunity to turn down. And I got to work, and well, it's going to be out in a few days. I did not, though, in the book include a footnote about some of my own high school experiences, and I'd like to share, as a tribute to a very important teacher to me, an experience I had when I was a freshman in high school. I was 13 years old when I started high school, and woefully intimidated about all I was going to face. We were new to the town. I knew no one at the school, except nice Mr. Mayhew, who would drive by every morning on his way to school. He was the chairman of the math department there, and he would wave to me, and I would wave to him, and I would walk up the street to the bus stop, and he was gone around the corner. And I discovered very quickly that high school was hard. Science was hard. English was hard. They expected you to know symbolism. And then they handed me Shakespeare, and English wasn't even in English. Spanish was another language altogether. History was easy, and then they discovered that for me it was too easy, so they said, "Dave, all right, independent project. We want you to read these 5 books and write a 30-page paper on Teddy Roosevelt and trust busting." I was a freshman in high school. Worst of all, though, worst by far, was for me mathematics. Algebra 1 with Mr. McCarthy was impossible. I was the very portrait of incomprehension. I would trudge into class, I would find my seat in the back corner, and I would open my notebook, and in the margin, just to the left of the red line in the notebook, I would write 60, 59, 58, 57, all the way down to 0. And as Mr. McCarthy would turn to the board and do problems, I would look at the clock and just cross out the minutes until they were over. And I would trudge home from school, and my mother would say, "How was school, dear?" And I would say, "Lousy." And I grew ever more forlorn. And nowhere is there a target more vulnerable to advice than a forlorn 9th grader. My father said, "Well, you're just going to have to work harder." which is not what I wanted to hear. I could slam my head against the wall all day. Algebra, to me, it seemed like a code designed to keep me out. Once math went out of numbers and into letters, what's that about? I mean, x times 2 equals 6. Well, what's x? Well, x is x. If you wanted it to be 3, say 3. Anyway, it was misery. It was misery. It was misery. My father said, well, you're just going to have to work harder. My mother said, well, go talk to the teacher. And then my Uncle Tommy stepped in. Every family needs to have an Uncle Tommy. Uncle Tommy was Peter Pan. Uncle Tommy was Zorba the Greek. He was Henry David Thoreau. He was unlettered, but in his way, a genius for happiness. And he took me aside and he said, Davy, come here, let me give you a little advice. In Massachusetts, the word here has 2 syllables. Here, come here. One quick story to illustrate what the kind of guy Tommy was. There are 957, but this is sort of a quick one. My brothers and I used to go with Tommy and just sort of skunk around. We'd get in his car and we'd go try to chase up some trouble. We'd go to the beach and build a driftwood fort, and we'd make a driftwood fire, and we'd open a can of beans, and we'd spend the night there. Things like that all the time. On one of our skunking around expeditions, we all alerted him to a need to go to the bathroom. And so he said, okay, fine. He pulled over at the little airport and parked, and we all got out of the car. I have 2 brothers. So all 4 of us get out of the car, and we're walking into the bathroom. And Tommy, his feet were always like this, and he walked like this. And so he comes walking into the men's room like this, and he steps up to the urinal and pulls his hand out of his pocket to address logistics. And as the hand came out, a dime went flying. And it was like one of those slow motion moments in a movie where you go, no, and you try to dive to catch the dime before it goes into the urinal. Well, the dime went directly into the urinal. There it sat. And Tommy stood there looking at it. And we all watched him and thought, now what is he going to do? He looked at it, and then he reached into his back pocket, and he pulled out his wallet, and he took $1 from the wallet and dropped that in too. And then he reached in and took them both out. It wasn't worth reaching in for a dime. So when that guy gives a kid, Tommy was my parents' generation, but he was our age. When Tommy gives advice, you listen. And Tommy said to me, come here, I'll give you some advice. Get F's in September. I said, what? He said, get F's in September. That way, in June, when you get the D, everybody celebrates. And of all the advice I got about math, that made the most sense to me. So I'm in the back of the class counting off the minutes, and the inevitable quiz arrives, and I got an F. There's my F in September. The test arrived. I got another F. Another quiz, F. And I'm thinking, oh, this is so miserable. This is awful. Maybe I'll get a D in June. And the report card came out in October, and I really didn't want to look at it too closely, but I finally snuck a look, and there was Algebra 1, Mr. McCarthy, D. D. I was the beneficiary of a fraud. This was awful, and suddenly I was cast into this terrible moral quandary. I mean, what do I do about this? This was fraud, but it's to my benefit. And so finally, I went to see Mr. McCarthy. I'd never spoken to him before. And I said, Mr. McCarthy, I'm David McCullough. I'm in your 9:30 class. He goes, I know who you are. I said, there's been some mistake. And he said, what's that? I said, well, in my report card, it said I have a D. And he said to me, you're the first kid in 37 years of teaching who's come to me to complain about a grade that was too high. I said, well, I failed every quiz you've given. He said, you know what? You're a good kid. Don't worry about it. My daughter tells me today that the expression I would have used then is swag on. So I'm going, swag on. So I thought, okay. Got my D, I'm all right. And September Fs became in class, October Fs, which became November Fs. But the report cards kept saying D. And I thought, no, I may be a good kid, I guess, but I'm a horrible math student. This isn't right. But okay, I'll live with it. Until I learned in April that if one passes Algebra 1, one is then compelled to go to Algebra 2. And I thought, oh no, the misery continues, the humiliation. It was just horrifying. And I was cast immediately into yet another horrible funk in which I was coming to specialize in that chapter of my life. And I didn't know what I was going to do about it. And so I went back to Mr. McCarthy, and I said, Mr. McCarthy, I appreciate these Ds, but I'm fearing what's going to happen to me next year. He said, don't worry about it, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. Tell you, if you pass the test, the final exam, you'll get your D, you'll earn it, you'll be fine. Okay. Well, final exam time came, and it was a Scantron. It was a fill-in-the-bubble test. And I looked at it, and I looked at the questions, and it was all to me still, after a year of sitting in the back of the room watching Mr. McCarthy's back as he solved problems, and I wondered what the heck the hieroglyphics were about. I sat down, and I said, okay, and I just went B, C, D, D, F, B, sort of like when I was writing for my father. I just, okay, didn't matter, I didn't know. I passed. I passed, and I knew no algebra whatsoever. I didn't want to confess as much to my parents, but they read my mood pretty quickly over the course of the summer, and I said, you know, Mom, Pop, I'm going to be in Algebra 2, and I don't know anything about algebra. And there was discussion about maybe buying me a textbook and that I could teach myself over the summer. Yeah, that'll... And then mention was made of Mr. Mayhew down the street, nice Mr. Mayhew who drives by and waves at me. And I would see him in the high school from time to time. He was, Mr. McCarthy, my first-year teacher, was really old. He was probably 60. Mr. Mayhew was merely old. He was 50 in there. And he wore baggy corduroys, and he would come down the hall in sort of all business fashion. And I knew he recognized me. I didn't think he knew I was one of those McCullough kids. I don't think he knew who I was particularly. So we called him up, and I said, Mr. Mayhew, I'm David McCullough. I live down the street. Yeah, I know who you are. And I've been having trouble with algebra. He said, yes, I know you have. I thought, well, how do you know that? And I was wondering if maybe you might be willing to tutor me. This was in August. And he said, yeah, sure, come on down. And I said, okay, when would be a good time? He said, now. I thought he was going to say a week from Thursday. So I get on my bike, and I pedal down to Mr. Mayhew's house, and he met me at the kitchen door. And to be, I was then 14, to be 14 on a beautiful August day with summer coming quickly to a close, the last thing you want to do is sit with a math teacher and be tutored and reminded how ignorant you are and how little you know. And it was embarrassing and humiliating. I come up the steps, and he says hello and shows me through the kitchen into the living room. And I sat down on the couch, and he pulled out a piece of paper, and he wrote a problem on the piece of paper. And he said, let's see how you do with that one. And I looked at it, and I looked up at him. And in looking up at him, I saw on the far wall a picture of 4 Grumman Wildcats flying in formation. And I loved World War II airplanes. I could tell you everything about every World War II airplane. A World War II airplane was the coolest thing. Only cooler plane than the Grumman Wildcat was, of course, the P-51 Mustang, which was the coolest plane of all. Anyway, I look up and I said, Grumman Wildcat. And he looked at me and said, do you know those planes? I said, sure. And I jumped up and I went over to look at it closer. And he came over and he picked up he pointed and he said, that one right there, that's me. I went, what? He said, that's me. And in pointing to, I also noticed that he was missing his fingertips. On one hand, all the fingertips were gone. They were shorter fingers. And he said, that's me right there. I said, Mr. Mayhew, what happened to your hand? He said, oh, I got shot. I said, you were shot? He said, yeah, that's me right there. I flew ground support at the Battle of Iwo Jima. I fought above, he said, and he wasn't bragging, he was a very modest guy. He said, I fought above Guadalcanal. Now, Mr. Mayhew, nice Mr. Mayhew, flew Wildcats. He'd been at Iwo Jima. He'd been at Guadalcanal. He was so cool. And then he said to me, let's sit down. It's important you learn this stuff. And as if a switch was thrown, cliches, as if a switch was thrown, suddenly I thought, this guy, a World War II fighter pilot wounded in action, thinks it's important for me to learn algebra. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try. So I sat down, and he helped me along. And I didn't get very far. I tried and I tried and I tried, and we had several sessions, but I went to him 2-3 times a week for the several weeks before school began. And on the first day of school, I got my schedule, and I looked down to see Algebra 2, and the teacher was Mr. Mayhew. I worked very hard that September, and when the first test came along, I got a D. And I earned it. It was a real D. It wasn't half. It was a real D, and I'd earned it. Flash forward decades, and I'm now a teacher. And I see dispirited kids all the time. I see kids who are struggling, and I see kids who have given up. And I'm very thankful to Mr. Mayhew for engaging me with him, showing me that he's a human being, showing me the respect that it's important that I learn algebra. I didn't care about algebra, but he cared about algebra, and he said it's important for me to know it. And it perked me right up. Today, one sees so many parents eager for their children to enjoy all the culture's plums, that rather than, and anxious about it, that rather than inspire them to climb the plum tree, rather than teaching them how to climb the plum tree, they go by a stepladder, or they reach up to a branch and pull it lower for the kid to get it, or they take him to an easier tree. And it's so frustrating as a teacher to see that. Kids today need to struggle. They need sometimes to scrape along the bottom. And then, when they succeed, and they will, they'll realize it's their own doing and that they got it themselves. That's my talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.